Good evening, everybody. I'm Gadi Levy, Executive Director of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, and I'm pleased to welcome you to an event about a place and an issue we hold dear, Israel. As a home for all things Jewish, the Streicker Center offers a wide range of programs, not only about our history and traditions, but about the other passions of our community, from politics to music, food, film, and social justice. And we are doing so this semester with Deborah Lipstadt, Harvey Fierstein, Yotam Ottolenghi, Frank Bruni, Tina Brown, Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla, and the iconic singer Judy Collins, among many others. I hope you will join us again soon. But no matter the diversity of our programming, the Streicker Center always returns to Israel, to its history, culinary diversity, cultural energy, and of course, its internal and external successes and struggles. So tonight, we are honored to welcome a distinguished guest who, with no diplomatic experience, became the U.S. ambassador to Israel, threw away the long-standing playbook for Middle East negotiations, and broke the stalemate, opening the way to the signing of the Abraham Accords. He also guided the U.S. and Israel into a new era that led to the long-delayed moving of the embassy to Jerusalem and American recognition of Israel's control over the Golan Heights. In his new book, Ambassador David Friedman takes us into the Oval Office, to the negotiation tables, and the significance of those historic breakthroughs. Recognized by the Jerusalem Post as one of the most influential Jews in the world, he joins us tonight to discuss the calculation to his approach, the leverage the U.S. applies to firm up Israel's place in the Middle East, and what he expects will happen next. If you have any questions for him, please post them at any time at the chat function. We will get to as many as possible. You can also order the copy of the book using the link posted now in the chat room. Our moderator this evening is Joshua Davidson, Temple Emanu-El Senior Rabbi. Please join me in welcoming him and Ambassador David Friedman.
Mr. Ambassador, it's an honor to welcome you to Temple Emanu-El and our Streicker Center virtually, and we hope to have you back in person very soon. Welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's really, the honor is mine. Thank you so much. I look forward to our discussion.
Me too. I enjoyed your book very, very much. While there were elements that I found challenging, and I'll ask you about some of those, without question, it speaks to your commitment to Israel and to a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. So let me begin there a little bit with your personal commitment. You write about the theological underpinnings of your commitment to Israel as a Jewish state, specifically that God promised it to the Jews. And you even at times reflect on your work perhaps as an unfolding of God's will. I think it's fair to say that theological doctrine doesn't always make room for compromise. So to what degree did such theology impact your diplomatic efforts, or did you leave it outside when you entered the negotiating room?
So that's a really good question, and not an easy question to answer. I'm the son of a rabbi, as you are, and I grew up in an observant home, and I studied in yeshiva for many years, and to this day, 62 years later, I'm still a believer. I believe in God. I believe in the sanctity of the Torah. I believe that the land of Israel was promised to the Jewish people by God, and that may be some of the whether it's baggage or whether it's some enlightenment or something in between. It's who I am, and I bring that with me wherever I go because it's part of who I am. At the same time, in my job as ambassador, I represent the United States of America. We don't make our policy on the basis of theology. We have a First Amendment that establishes no religion. And it's very important to me to make sure that in my job I'm representing the United States in a way that is basically what's in the best interest of our country, not what best advances my theology. So Look, as far as compromise goes, there's, the Jewish people for as long as there have been Jewish people have been in the business of compromise. I mean, that's been a feature of the robust debate among Jewish people that has led to our evolution in practices today. I don't believe that theology doesn't present to me a level of rigidity that, causes me not to, think independent of my theology, to my own life experiences and my desires to improve humanity. So I never saw that as a conflict. I mean, lots of people who are deeply religious, I think, still participate in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and in fact, in Israeli internal society, with a view towards compromise rather than strict dogma.
Well, you had a great many significant accomplishments. The recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the embassy there, the Abraham Accords among them. Let's start with Jerusalem. Why did you feel it was so important to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move the embassy? And why did you see the risks the recognition and move might pose to peace with the Palestinians so differently than preceding U.S. administrations?
So I started from the perspective of the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which was enacted by overwhelming majorities of Congress in 1995. And that law provided that we would recognize Jerusalem as the undivided capital of the state of Israel, and then move our embassy subject to waivers for national security. So I began with, there was a law that dictates that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel that has been endorsed by essentially almost the totality of the American people. And so the question is not whether we move the embassy to Jerusalem or we recognize Jerusalem, but why wouldn't we? Having obtained this legislation, why would we not honor this when we honor almost every other aspect of legislation that's lawfully passed? And so, to me, the only argument for not moving the embassy was because somehow there was some doubt. There was some doubt as to whether or not Jerusalem really was the undivided capital of the state of Israel, or there was some doubt as to whether or not it was the capital of Israel at all. Now, we came into office on the heels of a UN resolution that, to me, was very disturbing. Different people feel about it differently, but when the United States allowed UN Resolution 2334 to pass, which essentially, in its core, held that the old city of Jerusalem is illegally occupied territory. So I'm coming into an environment now where there was a UN resolution that challenges the very connection of the Jewish people to the city of Jerusalem. So, from that perspective, I thought it was very appropriate to push back. But even without that, I think that my own view of advancing the relationship with the Palestinians is that it has to be on the basis of reality and truth. And, for decades, the Palestinians were arguing that, oddly enough, this argument is not even makeable, that somehow Jerusalem was holy to Christians but not to Jews. Of course, that's impossible because the Christian who they're referring to came to Jerusalem for the festivals when he was a Jew. But the whole point was, I really thought we needed to get through this. We needed to show that we were going to observe the law, and there was no national security. I mean, the notion that there was a national security risk to moving the embassy was one we thought about for months. We looked at all the issues. I became convinced that there wouldn't be any material violence, and I think that was borne out. The other part about moving the embassy, which was important, the president made a promise, and what I said to him is, the world is really looking at you now to determine whether or not you're a politician like everybody else. You make promises, you keep them, you don't keep them, or whether or not you're going to keep a promise. And if you don't keep the promise, just think about who is it that exactly you are afraid of. I mean, who is the United States? For what reason is the United States not going to observe the laws that have been around for almost 25 years? And if you kind of retreat from your promise in this context, I thought that would resonate. It would resonate in Iran. It would resonate in North Korea. It would resonate throughout all the adversaries we have in the world, that somehow the United States is a paper tiger and is not willing to stand behind its principles. So I thought it was important for Israel. It was important for For our policy, it was important for how the president's foreign policy would then be scaled out in the rest of the world.
And there was violence that unfolded at the time of the opening of the embassy out of Gaza.
There was. Now, so there was, and there had been violence. There had been violence in Gaza for weeks before. The violence was driven off of the refusal of the Palestinian Authority to release funds to Hamas because of an inter Palestinian conflict that was going on. The violence was easy enough to instigate because it was happening independent of the Jerusalem embassy move, and there was violence, and it's regrettable and it's unfortunate, and I wish it hadn't happened. But of the 90+% of the people that were killed, and there were about 50, 60 people killed, it's unfortunate, but they were all Hamas militants, and were rushing the border. And look, Hamas is we don't have time for a Hamas discussion tonight, but the reality is that if a Hamas terrorist is able to cross into Israel, there will be tens of lives lost if that were to happen, and Israel just can't permit any porousness of that border. It's too dangerous. So as they rushed the border, there was regrettable violence. Every human life, we regret the loss of every human life, but that, I don't think that was a direct consequence of the embassy move, because it was happening, weeks before we had that ceremony.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Yitzhak Rabin. You write about Rabin and suggest that the left distorts his approach to peace. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So, Yitzhak Rabin was the architect of the Oslo Accords, the most recent, the most advanced agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. He lost his life tragically by a Jewish terrorist, and he's considered the godfather of the peace movement within Israel. And he was a great man, and but need to be honest about what his views were. He was no leftist. Rabin's view, when Rabin went to the Knesset to seek approval of the Oslo Accords, first of all, he needed the Arab parties to agree in order to get his 61 seats. But what he said to those people was, he said, here's my vision of where the Oslo Accords will lead. We will lead to peace in which the Palestinians have less than a state, and the Jewish people will remain in large portions, or not large portions. Jewish people will remain in sections of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, as I refer to it. So that was his view. That was his vision. He would not have approved of a Palestinian state the way we would typically consider a state with control of its borders, a state with control of its electromagnetic spectrum, a state with control of its airspace. He would not have agreed to that. Now you fast forward to 2022, and people revere Rabin and say, if we hadn't lost him, we would have had peace with the Palestinians. But just understand what Rabin's vision of peace with the Palestinians is not different materially at all from our vision of peace with the Palestinians that we authored in 2020. And Mahmoud Abbas ripped up that agreement publicly at the Security Council. So I just think that you can get a little carried away with the with the prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace. It's regrettable. It's heartbreaking, but in our desire for peace, we have to be clear-eyed about the risks. The risks are enormous, and I don't think Rabin thought, and I don't think today, and I don't think any Israelis who consider themselves responsible for national security in Israel would think it's possible to provide Palestinians with a real autonomous state, because I think they think it could be an existential threat to Israel, and I agree. And the other thing I would just point out is, these folks aren't Boy Scouts. And I'm not talking about Hamas, which I think everybody would agree is a terrorist organization, but the Palestinian Authority is highly corrupt. It is an authority that outlaws homosexuality. It's highly misogynistic. There's no system of human rights, no real justice system, and no financial transparency. So when we talk about, creating a Palestinian state in aid of peace, we should just know, what we're putting our fingerprints on right now. I hope it changes. I'd love to see another, leadership emerge that views differently. I think they will one day. But if you look at the peace plan that we wrote in 2020, one of the things we wrote is that this thing doesn't get activated until the Palestinians are able to create the type of internal advancements within their society that convinces, the world that they're prepared to live as a liberal democracy within this neighborhood, not where they are now. So it's enormously complicated, but I haven't given up.
I'm going to ask you about the details of the plan in a little bit, but I want to ask you about the process of the plan, because that was really fascinating to read about in the book. You refer to the process of approaching peace between Israel and the Palestinians as a form of arbitrage. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. So, so in life, you don't always know what the future will bring. And so when you move forward, especially with something as sensitive as this, you want to try to put something in motion where whichever way, the winds turn, however the market moves, to use a financial expression, you have it covered. And so the way I looked at the plan, and I'm going to speak for myself here, there were several authors and several participants, and everybody's going to have their own book coming out one day. They'll all describe it their own way. But the way I saw it was that we have a plan. Okay, number one, is there a reason to even move forward with it at all? I mean, the Palestinians are going to reject it. Why bother? So the first point is, well, number one, I think it's important, at least aspirationally, to show that the state of Israel is willing to make concessions for the benefit of the Palestinians. Why? Well, number one, because everyone says Israel, doesn't want peace. I mean, lots of Israel's enemies say they don't want peace. Some people say they're an apartheid state. So if Israel can get up and say, look, here's a map, and we're willing to increase the geographic footprint of the Palestinians by 100%. Okay, it may not be perfect. It may not be what the Palestinians want, but it is. When you're willing to double the geographic footprint of your adversary, that's pretty inconsistent with being, an apartheid state or someone that doesn't want peace. So that was first, to put that on the table. The second thing is that once Israel was able to demonstrate that, we thought it would start to open up the views of Israel's neighbors to say, you know what, Israel's making a public statement that they're willing to make peace. Where will that take us? So then, the question is, well, how did we get Israel in the first place to make these concessions? So remember, Israel was in perpetual elections during the last 2 years of our, it's just every 6 months they couldn't form a government going through elections. So how do you get this out during an election period? So one of the things we said is, look, and I was certainly the most active advocate of this, but I've said for years that Israel has an eastern border that is completely undefined right now. And it's been undefined for 50 years. And there's good reasons why it's undefined. I mean, there's over 2 million Palestinians living there, and there's 500,000 Jews. And no one really knows exactly what to do with it. But you got to talk about it. You got to move forward. You got to think about it. You got to have some progress here. So I thought that was in and itself valuable. And one of the things that we agreed with Israel was, well, in the context of this plan, there's about 30% of the entirety of Judea and Samaria that we would agree that Israel can recognize sovereignty of. And, different people thought that was important to different extents. I thought it was important. I mean, I do believe that, and part of this is my theology, and part of it is my diplomacy, and part of it's my politics. But I do think that it's important for Israel to say this is the territory we must have. We don't need to have this, we don't need to have that, but we have to have this, and start defining, what is sort of the minimal boundaries that it must have within this disputed territory. So I thought that was valuable for lots of reasons. Obviously, the right-wing Israeli government thought that would be good because this might be their only chance to have an agreement with the United States, which would permit them to extend sovereignty into the region. I thought that would be a good thing. I also knew that it was going to cause a massive controversy, much more than Jerusalem, much more than the Golan Heights. Not just because, with Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, we kind of sprung it on everybody, but also because, this is where the rubber hits the road. The Golan Heights is a fight between Israel and Syria. Nobody really thinks that Syria has the better argument. Jerusalem has been the law of the United States for more than 20 years. Here, Judea and Samaria, this is where Israel has more than 2 million Palestinians that don't want to be part of Israel and want autonomy. So this is really the crux of the conflict. And so, so I thought it would be enormously helpful for Israel to define what it wants and to defend that position, even if it doesn't get everything it wants. I also thought that in the context of all this controversy, there might be an opportunity for all these other countries that we've been talking with since 2017. You should just know that, when we first met with Netanyahu, the first thing he said is, I can't make peace with the Palestinians, but I can make peace with the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis. So this was always something. So, based upon conversations, we thought that, there might be a basis upon which Israel might delay that exercise of sovereignty. And that would give cover to some of these countries to come in and say, we want to, this is the moment. This is the moment to surface what had been a private relationship between Israel and all these countries. And so it was going to go in one or two directions, either one of which was okay with me. I mean, everybody had their preferences, but, we were either going to have this sovereignty movement that I thought would be helpful to Israel, albeit, there'll be some turbulence, or we'd have this opportunity for peace. Now, we all knew that if there was an opportunity for peace, that would be paramount, and that's where we ended up. And it was clear that from this whole discussion, that some of these countries really wanted to get closer to Israel for lots of good reasons. It makes all the sense in the world. And by delaying sovereignty, they could look at the Palestinians and say, you know what? We pushed this off. We pushed this off for you. Now we're going to look after our own interests and move forward with Israel. And that was the right dynamic to move forward with the Abraham Accords. So that's the arbitrage. Two directions. We weren't sure which one at the beginning. We kind of worked both vectors. Jared Kushner was certainly working one vector harder. I was working the other vector harder. We were talking to each other every day, and we ended up where we ended up.
The Abraham Accords are obviously a singular signal accomplishment. You indicated that there were quiet, functional relationships that existed between Israel and these countries, but the opportunities that the accords create are different and new. Can you talk a little bit about the new opportunities that
Sure.
exist?
The opportunities are massively different. I mean, before you have the Mossad taking covert flights back and forth, talking about security, talking about Iran, talking about intelligence. I mean, it's important, but it's not a relationship between two countries. With the Abraham Accords, what we found, and this is in contrast to the peace that was reached between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, but with the Abraham Accords, especially with the Emirates and the Morocco and with Bahrain, the people came together like they were long lost cousins, which biblically they are. They came together like they were long lost cousins. Within weeks, the flights began, the business meetings began, the discussions began. All of a sudden, I mean, if you go to, I know it's tough to get to Israel these days, but if you go to Ben Gurion and you look at the flight board, there's more flights to the Emirates and Bahrain than almost any other place in the world right now. When you go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai, you have a huge selection of kosher restaurants and kosher food. There's a Holocaust museum that opened up in Dubai. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who's really one of the most forward-thinking leaders, I think, in the world today, he's building the Abrahamic Faith Center right now in Abu Dhabi, which contains a synagogue named after Maimonides, named after the Rambam, a church and a mosque, all within one facility. The Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans actually found that they like the Jewish people, they like the Israelis, and vice versa. People are coming on exchange programs. They're coming on. The tourism is expanding. It's mind-boggling. And one of the things that I get the biggest kick of is when I fly from Israel to Abu Dhabi or to Manama, and you look at the flight screen. For most of the flight, you're flying over Saudi Arabia. And, the notion even 2 years ago that Israel could fly over Saudi Arabia was unthinkable. They used to have to fly from Tel Aviv to New Delhi. It takes Israel like an extra 3.5 hours because they have to go all the way around the Persian Gulf. And so this is so gratifying from a people-to-people perspective. The amount of trade is growing. The countries are getting more secure. They obviously have a common enemy in Iran, which is a factor, but far from the only factor, and what brings these countries so close to each other.
So with the signing of the accords, first it was the United Arab Emirates, then the Kingdom of Bahrain, then Sudan, along with Kosovo and Morocco, normalized relations with Israel. Do you see other nations coming along?
I do. I think that what you need to sort of understand is that every one of these deals was different. And I'll give the Emiratis they were the Nachshon, if you will, the ones who jumped in first, and they deserve enormous amount of credit. But each one of them had their own needs and issues and concerns. And so these are 5 bilateral agreements. But what they all have in common in every one of their cases is the United States acting, sort of providing comfort, providing cheerleading, but also kind of, elevating the status of these countries into important allies. Each one of these countries began to feel like they were valued as an ally. And one of the things we did by, standing with Israel so strongly is we kind of demonstrated how America could treat a friend. And these other countries said, we want to be treated the same way. So they wanted to come into this circle of peace. But it requires active engagement by the United States. It also requires strength by the United States against common enemies. So if you ask me, what's the biggest challenge right now to scaling this, I would probably say, we have to solve our policy on Iran. We have to get that right, because as long as Iran continues to threaten the region, it definitely places limitations on the extent to which this can be scaled. If America stands up to Iran and shows that it truly will not tolerate a nuclear Iran, which we say all the time. We say, and I'm not looking to be critical of a particular politician, but we all say it. But what does it really mean? What does it really mean that we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon? When that statement is given real life and credibility, and I'm not sure sitting here right now how that's going to happen. That I think puts us in a position to really scale this. I think the Saudis are next. I think they probably would have been next, had we hung around for a little bit longer. But I think this could extend to places like Indonesia, even Pakistan. I mean, look, I believe that and I'll just say I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I sat with Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, who's the brother of the Crown Prince in Abu Dhabi. And what he said to me, I think, is absolutely right. He said the conflicts of the modern age are not between countries. They're between ideologies. He said that the moderates are fighting the extremists, and the moderates have to win. And so, within a particular country, you could have then an internal conflict between moderates and extremists. Ultimately, we're all fighting extremism. And so what that suggests is that Israel and the moderate Arab states and the soon to become moderate Arab states, because there are countries that are moving there, they actually have more in common than they've ever had before. Because Israel's been fighting radical extremism since its birth. And it knows how to do it. And so, that to me suggested that, we're really onto something here. And I do believe if, we don't know what the world's going to bring, but, there's a real chance that the Arab-Israeli conflict can come to an end. And, if the follow-up question, well, what about the Palestinians? I think with new leadership, I think the Palestinians they have to see that this explosion of peace presents enormous opportunities to them. A lot of the travel now between Israel and the Arab countries includes Arab and Palestinian travelers. So there's something to see. They can see there's a better world out there. There's more opportunity, and I hope that we're able to provide more and more opportunity to the Palestinian people, so that they can focus more on the opportunities for their children rather than the grievances of their parents.
Let's come back to the the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because obviously that doesn't go away just because peace is made with other Arab nations. You write that you believe that the settlements ought to be considered a part of Israel, but you also acknowledge that the Palestinian population living in Judea and Samaria can't simply be ignored as if they weren't there.
Absolutely.
You also write that a two-state solution may one day be the way out of the conflict, and you set about creating the vision for that. So can you describe, in your view, what made the Trump administration's vision for peace one that benefited both Israelis and Palestinians, the compromises each side was required to make, and whether you think there could be one day the political will on either or both sides to get there?
So, look, there are different aspects of the plan that have different levels of controversy. The territorial allocation that we made was our best guess of what we thought could work. Remember, back in 2006, Israel forced the evacuation of Jews from Gush Katif in the Gaza Strip. Now, I mean, I've been to Israel 100 times. I think I was in Gaza once or twice, before it was abandoned. So it wasn't a place that had particular meaning to most Israelis. Nonetheless, in 2006, when Israel forced the evacuation of 8,000 Jews from Gaza, it almost provoked a civil war. I mean, that's how strong the feelings were about that. Now, take that, fast forward to 2022, and we have 500,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria, in some of in large communities, places that, if you walk, settlement is not really the right word. I mean, these are very advanced, as I'm sure very advanced communities. They're cities, right? So, our view was just, look, you can debate all you want whether people should have moved in or not moved in, whether the government should have expanded it. I mean, I'm obviously not against that, but, reasonable people can debate what would have been best. But where we are today, for better or worse, there isn't any means by which Israel could evacuate tens of thousands of Jews from Judea and Samaria without causing a massive internal civil war. It's not worth it. So our plan basically said, okay, guys, we're assuming that over the last 50 years you chose what you wanted. Okay, so why don't you just stay there, stay put? Okay, we'll create enough land for natural growth and expansion and contiguity. But that's it. And then, whatever you didn't take so far, let's move that over to the other side, because there's 500,000 of you and there's 2 million of them, and they don't have enough land. So why don't you move that over? When you do the math, we basically allocated, the territory, roughly speaking, in proportion to the population. Now, that's not going to work for the existing Palestinian leadership. They want virtually 100% of the territory. And I mean, it's just not doable. It's not. I mean, again, I personally don't believe it's appropriate, but I also don't think it could be done anyway. So we put out a plan. So territorially, we were not where the Palestinians were. On the issue of refugees, there is a desire on the part of the Palestinians to move significant populations back into the land of Israel. But the whole point of the two-state solution was to fix the demography, right? So if you're moving Palestinians into Israel on a theory of repatriating refugees, you haven't fixed that problem. But more importantly, this is from a war that happened, 74 years ago. There have been refugees ever since in all parts of the world that have been settled, into other places, and somehow, with UNRWA, what happens with refugees is they're sort of parked in different places and maintained in kind of a hostile fashion to remain angry at Israel. That's not a population Israel is going to ever absorb. And look, to be fair, there were 600,000 Arab refugees, that were created in 1948. When Israel was recognized in 48, within the next couple of years, there were an equal number of refugees that were created with Jews being thrown out of Arab lands. And none of those Jews are asking to be repatriated. None of them are asking for compensation right now. So, there are certain problems that just, there's a lot of injustice in the world. You can't remedy every injustice. And so, that was a big issue that we couldn't think of any way to really deal with refugees except to say, this was a long time ago. There have been a lot of refugees created over history. There's lots and lots of refugees out there now. There's millions of refugees coming out of Syria and other war-torn nations that we're all better off focusing our attention on. And we're going to have to think, move forward, not move backwards. So that was an issue that, that we couldn't get traction on. But, ultimately, Rabbi, the issues, it wasn't about a particular issue, at least not in my mind. My view is this. Mahmoud Abbas is about 85 years old. He won an election 16 years ago for 4 years. He's been hanging on. We now say, he's in the 16th year of a 4-year term. And he's hanging on. And his kids are wealthy, and his family are wealthy, and his friends are doing okay. And Hamas wants to kill him, and other people want to kill him, and he's just he is not in a position to be a bold, courageous leader right now. He's just not. And he's his people have all but said that to me. Why bother? Better to die with your boots on as a fighter for the Palestinian cause than to start something which you're probably not going to be able to finish. To have death threats every day. The Hamas is in many respects more powerful than the PA. And so to start that kind of a civil war, it's just not in his interest. I mean, we need new leadership within the Palestinian society to step up and be far more creative and visionary than what we have right now. And I mean, it's regrettable, but it's my honest assessment of what we're dealing with.
So what were the compromises that you pushed Israel to make that might encourage future Palestinian leadership to accept the plan?
Well, the first thing was to take 50% of Area C, right, which is area. If you go back to the Oslo days, A is all Palestinian civilian and military control. B is Palestinian civilian and Israeli military control, and C is all Israeli civilian and military control. So Israel controls Area C. The idea was, number one, to take half of that, okay, and put it in the Palestinian column. They would end up with roughly 3/4 then of Judea and Samaria. In addition to that, had we moved forward with this, Israel would have committed a significant amount to, which I hope they'll do anyway, by the way. And again, it's hard to do with a government this diverse, but that Israel would invest some real money in Judea and Samaria. I mean, there's about 30 checkpoints going from Judea and Samaria into Israel. And if you work in Israel, you make about 4 times as much salary as you'd make in Judea and Samaria if you're a Palestinian. So the Palestinians all want to come into Israel to work. They have to go through a checkpoint. Some of these checkpoints are horrible. I'm not comfortable with them at all. And they've now been upgrading them. They've upgraded about a third of them to the point where they're really like going through a TSA checkpoint. You actually put in a card. It's all done on biometric technology. You look into a thing and you're through the gate in seconds. They need to upgrade those. So there's at least, subject to Israel's interest in avoiding security incidents, we need to improve the flow of people and the flow of goods back and forth from one territory to another. They need better roads. They need hospitals. I mean, there's things that should be invested. One of the things that I'm sort of encouraged by, there's this fund that was created in honor of Nita Lowey, the former congresswoman. It's not a small amount of money, and it's designed to improve Israeli-Palestinian relations, and it's focused for the first time, I think. I'm not a big fan so much, and I don't take this the wrong way. I'm not a big fan of people-to-people efforts. I think that, those things only go so far. What I like to see is industry, people getting together and actually working together and making money together and prospering together. I think that's way more important than, just my own nature, than sort of touchy-feely, events where you sort of talk to each other a little bit. I'm not saying people shouldn't talk to each other, but I think the real way to get people focused on a better life is through industry and commerce and working together and creating, value for themselves and their families. So this seems to be, from where I see that going, this seems to be heading in that direction. It's a bipartisan group. I think they're on the right track. So that's good. But getting back to your question about Israel's compromise, the compromises were territorial, and they were primarily taking the territory and making it much more livable and prosperous for the Palestinian people. That was the main thing. Now, the other thing that relates to the Arab world generally is Jerusalem. Now, when we speak to people throughout the Arab world, outside of the local Palestinian community, we talk about Jerusalem. There's a surprising lack of familiarity with Jerusalem. None of them have ever been there. And what they think of Jerusalem, they really think of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Right? No one's thinking about Ben Yehuda Street and King George or Sheikh Jarrah even. I mean, they're thinking about the mosque. And what I've been telling people, and it's been resonating, is, I wish I could bring you to the mosque. I mean, I don't personally go in the mosque for religious reasons, but I wish you could just come there and get a tour there. Because if you are standing at the Western Wall Plaza looking up at the mosque, there's 10 gates that are eligible for Muslim worshipers, and they walk in and out freely. There's no metal detectors or other. And then there's one gate called the Maghrabi gate that you can sort of see. It's that kind of rickety wooden gate that's up on the right side facing the Kotel. And that's the one that's available to what they refer to as non-believers, Jews and Christians. And they go through security and they go up there. And if a Jew, starts to move his lips in prayer, he's escorted off the mosque. So I said, look, here is the Temple Mount. The reality is it's the holiest place in Judaism. It's where the temple stood. It's where Mount Moriah stands. It's where Abraham sacrificed or almost sacrificed Isaac. Okay, and yet Israel has given the Muslim world a priority, a massive priority of worship in this area. And the mosque is not under threat. And if you go back in history, almost every violent episode between Israelis and Arabs in the land of Israel has been under this kind of false threat of Al-Aqsa being under siege back to 1929 in Hebron. So this is a story that doesn't get out enough. But, we started getting that out. And we said, come to Jerusalem. And we talked about building, a major Muslim tourist center in Jerusalem, because they'll find that, of all things, Israel is incredibly hospitable to the Muslim worshipers with regard to their third holiest site. And so that was also part of our plan.
I want to ask you a little bit about the Western Wall, and in doing so, shift a little bit to Americans' relationship with Israel. But first, with regard to the Kotel, this is an issue that is of significance to Reform Jews. You write about the challenges of securing space at the Western Wall where religiously liberal Jews can pray in ways that we would wish to. And it's an important symbolic matter for us because the lack of such a space suggests a rejection of the legitimacy of non-Orthodox Jewry by our spiritual homeland. And that's not good for the bonds that we would hope to strengthen between American Jews and Israel. So why can't this agreement get done? And can the U.S. ambassador to Israel do more to influence that decision?
So, I was sort of right there when it blew up. And I point out in the book, I met with Rabbi Jacobs. And, Rabbi Jacobs and I have all kinds of political differences, but I felt that pain very, very personally, because I feel deeply that every Jew needs to feel welcomed in the Jewish state. It's a huge failing on the part of the state of Israel not to be hospitable and welcoming to every Jew. And when a Jew feels unwelcome or unwanted or illegitimized by the state of Israel, I can only imagine that pain, because it would pain me terribly. if I felt that way, if all of a sudden, my connection to Israel was somehow put at risk, it would really very much go to the core of what I care about. So I sat there with him that day, and I said, you know what? Let me see if I can try to help. And it probably wasn't my job. It probably wasn't part of the job. But you get to define your job pretty much when you're an ambassador. So I said, let me try. I made some phone calls. I had some meetings, and I expressed my view that there should be a resolution. They asked me, what should the resolution be? I said, I don't know. I'm just not as sufficiently schooled in it. But you had a deal. You were so close. I mean, it ought to be something along the lines of what you already agreed to, I would think. This has to get fixed. I mean, and I don't know the answer to how it gets fixed, but it has to get fixed because, the Western Wall needs to be accessible to all the Jewish people. Now, the one thing that I would say, just to the American Jews who don't get this and can't understand why this is happening. I mean, this is not by way of excuse, but just by way of explanation. We all grew up in America, and America has a First Amendment that we all embrace. All of us, I think all Jewish people in America are so happy to live in a place where there is where the government is required to permit the free exercise of religion, and in a place where the government doesn't establish any religion. And that's a perfect formula for being Jewish in a country, and frankly, I think it's the best way to run a country. But Israel doesn't have a First Amendment, right? It's a Jewish state, and there are, being a Jew is the only religion. There's a national component to being a Jew, and there's a religious component to being a Jew. And in Israel, the religious component has been dominated since the beginning of the state by the Orthodox, because they're the ones who have, I don't want to say they've cared the most, but they're the ones who have been the most vocal, and they've taken all their political capital, and placed it within the democratic world in the religious issues. So that's where we are today. I really love all Jews, and I hate taking sides, because I have friends who are secular, I have friends who are atheists, I have friends Reformed, conservative, Orthodox. My father was a conservative rabbi. I've got friends who are Haredi. I really love the Jewish people, and I want all them to get along, and I would do anything I can to forge a consensus. I really hope it gets settled, and I really think, not to repeat myself, but Israel can't be seen as rejecting any stream of Judaism. It would be deeply wrong. And by the way, there are, one of my, as you may have read in my bio, I used to be active in a community in Israel called Beit El. It was one of the chief rabbis of Beit El was Rabbi Zalman Melamed. Brilliant man. His son is also a brilliant rabbi, and his son, I don't know if you saw, his son believes that the compromise should be observed. He thinks that he's extraordinarily observant, religious, right-wing Orthodox, beard, the whole getup. Strongly believes that Israel should honor the agreement, and that Israel has to be more hospitable to conservative and Reform Jews. So this is not without hope, and I think that, look, from what I understand, the government promised the Reform movement this would be resolved by now, and now they're stepping back from it. And I hope they resolve it. I really do. I mean, I don't want to. I'm not smart enough to know exactly what seals the deal, but I do really hope that it gets resolved.
Is this part of what you meant when you wrote in the epilogue that, quote, it's time for Israel to grow up?
Yeah. Look, to a certain extent, I'm not sure we've done Israel any favors by having so many organizations that give so much money to Israel and pay for all these things that most countries pay for on their own. I mean, we pay for all kinds of stuff that, and I'm not talking about museums or that are typically funded by donors, but we pay for some of Israel's, basic necessities, because we all love Israel so much and we appreciate the sacrifice that Jews make when they live in Israel. But here's the bottom line. Israel is older than more than half the countries in the world. At the General Assembly, more than half the countries are younger than Israel. It's been around now since 1948. That's almost 74 years. It has a thriving economy. Tel Aviv is one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive city to live in the world. People are buying 10, 20, $30 million, homes there every single day. There's a lot of wealth. There's a lot of achievement. There's a lot of accomplishment. The universities are first rate. They have a stunning defense establishment. Tough neighborhood, tough world. I mean, Iran is a serious, potentially existential threat, but, lots of countries have potentially existential threats. So, Israel is now in a position where I think it can look forward and start answering some of the questions that it has deferred because, it had so many more urgent things on its mind. One, what's as I said earlier, what should your eastern border be? You say you're never leaving Gush Etzion. You say you're never leaving Ma'ale Adumim. But the people who live in Gush Etzion and Ma'ale Adumim, when they want to build a house, they need to get approval of the IDF, not of the local zoning authority, because it's still in this state of hiatus. So, you say things, but do you really mean them? The relationship with as you alluded to, the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. What does that mean? How is Israel? Is Israel really a place that every Jew, can feel, comfortable, coming to and wants to come to? Because one of the points I made, I don't believe there is a future for the Jewish people without the state of Israel, and that's a harsh thing to say, but I just don't see it. I'll make the case quantitatively. I put this in my book. We had 12 million Jews. We had 18 million Jews in the world in 1941. We had 12 million Jews in 1945. So we lost 6 million Jews in those 4 years. So we were 12 million then. Now, there are different ways of counting, but, some people say we only have 15 million Jews today. We only come back halfway. Now, even if we came back all the way, depending upon how you count, every other nation in the world has doubled and tripled within that period of time. So we've had very, very modest growth. Now, where's the growth been? There were 5 million Jews in America in 1948. There were 600,000 Jews. There's still about 5 million Jews in America today. There's 7 million Jews in Israel. All the growth, the entirety of the growth of the Jewish people in the last 2 generations has been in Israel. America has stayed about flat, and almost everybody else in the world has gone down. So, and I said this to the Knesset. The Knesset was kind enough to allow me to make an address to them on the day that I left. I said, guys, the Jewish people is now in your hands. It's not in America's hands anymore. It's in your hands. The future, 100 years from now, however the Jewish people look and act, it's going to be based on what you do today. Are you going to support the Jewish people? Are you going to reach out to the Jewish people? Because the Jewish people, without Israel, the numbers tell us we don't have much of a future. We have a religion, we can observe, but the growth, the excitement, the energy is really in Israel. And you need to stop thinking just internally, but think about the enormous responsibility. Because of your success and your ability to grow and to develop and to be the great state you are today, you also have to assume the responsibility for the Jewish people, spiritually, existentially, and of course, as a place of refuge in places that need it. When we use the words "never again," we've all said "never again," time again. I asked the question: what does that really mean? Does never again mean anything without the state of Israel? My argument is no. I don't think if someplace in the world, some autocrat decides to start killing Jews, there is no place other than Israel that represents a possibility for them to be rescued. Unfortunately, the United States, is not the answer. The United States, I'm very critical of the United States and how they conducted themselves during World War II. We entered the war because we were attacked by Japan. That's why we entered the war. And if you ever read the letter by Henry Morgenthau to FDR, he was enormously critical about all the things FDR didn't do, especially in 1943 and 1944, to stop the transport of Jews to Auschwitz. So Israel, we all need Israel. We need it now like never before in so many different ways. But the Israelis need to know that with all their success and growth comes a tremendous responsibility for the future of the most ancient people on earth.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move to some of the questions that have been posed by people who are watching. The first one is from George, and I'm going to expand on it a little bit. You acknowledge in your book that you didn't agree with everything your boss, President Trump, said or did, and that he didn't always take your advice either. How did you respond either to him or just in your own heart to some of the remarks he made that many in the Jewish community felt were potentially dangerous to the Jewish community, such as his comments about fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, or even the nativist rhetoric, which, while it may not have been directed at the Jewish community, many believed stirred the brew which produces anti-Semitism?
I struggled with it. One of the advantages I had was, I'd known him for 20 years. So I wasn't hearing him from the perspective of somebody who is for the first time listening to him as the president of the United States. 20 years ago, I'd be sitting in a conference room on a Friday afternoon and we'd be in heavy negotiations on a deal. Again, I didn't represent him that often, but enough to be able to relate a story like this. And, we'd be fighting over some point, and the clock would strike 3. And I would say, it was in the winter. I said, I got to go. And everybody would say, what do you mean? We're in the middle of a critical point in our negotiations. I said, well, I got to go. I got to get home for Shabbos. And if I don't leave now, I'm not going to get home. So I'm leaving. And they'd look at Donald and say, Donald, your lawyer's killing us. He's leaving at a crucial point. And he'd say, look, that's who he is. I'm never going to try to change him. I respect his views and let him go. And he'll come back when he's ready. And so that's my personal relationship with him. And so, I have the benefit, which doesn't excuse some of the comments he said over the years, but I had this benefit of seeing him, over a long period of time in a very different light. He is extremely unscripted, and he will just get in front of a mic and start talking. Now, I looked at the transcript of Charlottesville, and I would invite other people to do it. I'm not here, to defend or to attack him. It was clear to me he was talking about a different group of people, because after he said they're very fine people, he said in the sentence that followed, not the next sentence, but the one right after, he says, of course, I'm not talking about white supremacists. I'm talking about fine people. I'm talking about other people who just came here, to try to preserve the history of the South. Now, again, you can take that for whatever you want. I'm not here to defend those comments, but I guess I know personally that he's not anti-Semitic, and I took my own comfort in that. I can point to you. And I would encourage people to go back and look at, the speeches he's made on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the speeches he's made on Israel's Independence Day, the speeches he's made on other occasions. Some of the most beautiful rhetoric in which he's condemned anti-Semitism and supported the Jewish people. So, in my mind, the criticism of Donald Trump is that when you're the president of the United States, you just can't get up and start talking. You can't wing it. Because sometimes when you wing it, you find that you say some things that you really wish you hadn't. Now, that's about all I got on that. But it's I did struggle with it, and I've talked to him, and I think I mentioned in the book that I wasn't with him on this on this issue of focusing on the 2020 election. I said to him, look, I think you did more in 4 years. I mean, your policies. Leave aside the rhetoric, the tweets, and all that stuff. I think you've done more in 4 years in certain areas than more good things than a lot of other presidents, many other presidents. And I would start focusing on my legacy, because I think you have a good story to tell. He was, he remains aggrieved by the 2020 elections. That wasn't my advice to him. And as you pointed out, I mentioned in my book that was one of the occasions where he didn't take my advice.
Daniel asks about your assessment of the current administration vis-a-vis the Middle East. How do you think the Biden-Blinken team is doing?
Look, I believe that the entire world, to remain safe, requires the United States to lead, and to lead forcefully, morally. and with a clear expression of what its red lines are and the willingness to back up those red lines if it needs to. I'm not talking about sending troops off to battle, but when 2 administrations ago, there was President Obama said he was setting up a red line if the Syrians gassed their own people, and he didn't hold it. Like after they went and did it, nothing really happened. When Trump was in office and the Syrians did it again, within a couple of days, 55 Tomahawk missiles were shot at the source of the chemical weapons attack. When we had the opportunity to eliminate the single greatest terrorist in the world, Qasem Soleimani, we did. I think those things are important. I think we need to be in a position where we want to be respected by our allies. We want to be trusted by our allies. We want to be feared by our adversaries. And it's harsh, but it's my view of the world. And I don't think that we're feared enough. I don't think we're on the right path in Iran. And I think that the evacuation from Afghanistan, there are a few pictures in life that sort of, tell 1,000 words or 1,000,000 words that get seared into our consciousness. The Marines planting the flag in Iwo Jima. Everybody's seen that picture. The Vietnamese priest who self-immolated in Hanoi. Everybody knows that picture. It changed the way people think about the world. The picture of Afghanis hanging onto the wheel wells of an American jet as it flew out of Kabul, I think has been seared into the memory of a lot of people and caused a lot of people to wonder whether they can trust America. That's a terrible thing for Israel. It's a terrible thing for the region, terrible thing for all of us. So if I had advice for the Biden administration, it would be you need to get back to the point where America leads the world with principle and authority and strength. And regrettably, I don't think that that's where they're heading right now. That's my view.
Sam asks if you could talk a little bit about the opposition that you faced within the State Department and the Democrats in Congress to your positions.
So, look, I did a few dumb things before I was nominated for being ambassador to Israel. And the dumbest thing I did was, I had a running political conflict with a group called J Street. And I still don't agree with anything that they stand for, but that's beside the point. I said that they were worse than capos, and capos are, the Jews that sided with the Nazis during the Holocaust. Incredibly stupid thing to say, really stupid. And it was really stupid because it violated my own views, which is that never analogize anything to the Holocaust, even if you're not talking about Nazis. It just changes the conversation to a place where you're no longer talking about substance. You're talking about, it's a personal attack, and you personalize issues, and you're never gonna win the argument, and you're giving people who you don't agree with politically an opportunity to change the conversation in a way where you really can't win. So that was, I think, appropriately challenged by people in the Foreign Relations Committee. A lot of them said, you can't talk this way. We don't want an ambassador speaking this way. And they were right. And I said, look, as long as I'm ambassador, the United States ambassador to Israel, I'm going to keep that kind of rhetoric down to zero. And I did. I never said anything close to that in the 4 years that I was ambassador. But there were senators who I fully supported any senator who criticized that. That's a perfectly legitimate area of inquiry. But there were those that I thought took a more political view of my nomination. Now, if you look at the prior 19 ambassadors to Israel, they all got approved, like whatever the number, whoever showed up that day, that number to zero was the way they got approved. I had the most contested confirmation hearing in the history of the United States with regard to any bilateral ambassador. And I thought it was a little bit too much. And what I went and spoke with Senator Schumer, and who I thought was, not just the leader of the Democratic Party, but also the primary advocate for the Jewish people within the Senate. I said to him, look, your argument is that I'm not bipartisan enough. The real show of bipartisanship is for Democrats to support a right-wing president's selection of a right-wing ambassador the same way that the Republicans have for years supported the Democratic president's support of a left-wing ambassador. My predecessor, Dan Shapiro, perfectly qualified, good guy, loves Israel. Politically, we're in different parts of the world, but appropriately confirmed with no opposition, and yet ideologically very, very different than most of the Republicans who voted for him. And that was because there was a desire to achieve bipartisanship on Israel. What I said to Schumer is, look, we have, Trump won. His views on Israel are aligned with mine. And why can't just for the sake of unity, why can't the Democrats say, look, we don't agree with Friedman, but then again, they didn't agree with Shapiro. Let's just get past this thing and create and maintain that bipartisanship. I was hoping to achieve that. I asked a lot of senators on the Democratic side if they could see it clear to voting for me. It's whatever reservations they had. I said, look, I'm not going to embarrass any of you. If I tell you I'm not going to, attack anyone on the left with inappropriate personal attacks, I'm going to keep that promise, and I did. But I couldn't get there, so it was disappointing. I still would like to see more Republican-Democrat bipartisanship on Israel. The differences are significant. I mean, there are significant policy differences, and I don't think anybody should be forced to give up their political views in order to have a bipartisan support. But I think people can look past those differences on some basic issues of support for Israel.
Well, the policy differences, are significant, and I don't ask this next question critically, though I know some have. Some have said that in some ways you acted as if you were more Israel's ambassador to the United States than the United States' ambassador to Israel. How do you respond to that?
So look, I think it's an unfair criticism because I don't think anybody would have said that if I wasn't Jewish. And therefore, because I am Jewish, and therefore it brings up this whole trope of dual loyalty. I was an ambassador. I was the president's representative in the state of Israel. I don't do anything without the approval of the president of the United States. I don't do anything without the approval of Mike Pompeo. Rex Tillerson and I famously didn't get along, but Mike Pompeo came in as the Secretary of State. Mike Pompeo, frankly, is probably more pro-Israel than I am. Okay, no one's accused, Mike Pompeo of being the Secretary of State of the state of Israel. So what I find interesting is that, in this political world, there are a lot of people who are really, really pro-Israel. Okay, and the ones who aren't Jewish never get accused of this kind of dual loyalty trope. Only I do. And so, I don't think it's a fair accusation. I'm a big boy. I don't get, I'm not one to go out and accuse anybody of anti-Semitism. I think we ought to be careful what we consider anti-Semitism around, lest we start crying wolf and people think everything is anti-Semitism. So I'm not one of those kind of guys, but I do think it's really an unfair accusation because so many other people who outrank me had the same views that I had, and none of them bore that accusation.
You have some college friends who are watching tonight. Aaron asks, some of Ambassador Friedman's college friends are listening in, and we'd like to know if any specific Columbia courses or books you read while at the college helped you in your work as a diplomat.
So, I sat in on a course of Edward Said, who is probably the intellectual father of the Palestinian movement, and found him, absolutely brilliant, and challenged my thinking. Very helpful to me in challenging my own thinking and refining my thinking. And I took a course with. I don't remember his first name, but it was an advanced Hebrew literature course by a Professor Barzilai. And what he taught me, and I'll never forget it, he said that, in contrast to like Greek mythology and Roman mythology and all the Babylonian myths, everybody's a hero. If you looked at the Bible, the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, you look at all the stories, you would think they were written by an anti-Semite, because every story about a Jew, almost every story about a Jew, is pejorative. It shows all the foibles. I mean, all the temptations, all the mistakes that we've made. From Moses on down. Even Moses, the greatest prophet of all time, was flawed and not permitted to complete his life's work. To King David and Bathsheba, to so many. The whole book of Judges is one act after another of betraying God, to the golden calf. I mean, we get the Bible at Mount Sinai, and in a matter of days, because Moses a few days late were creating a golden calf. I mean, what kind of crazy people are we? And I was struck by that observation that the Jewish people really are different. We have these ancient texts, but we're not afraid to show our warts and to show our failings, with the hope that people will learn from them and try to get better. So it was an observation that stayed with me, through the last, I guess it's probably about 45 years. I can't believe it's been that long, but it's been a long time. But thank you to my friends, whoever you are. Thank you for that question.
They'll text you later, I'm sure. All right, so I'm going to close with a question asked by Eric. In your opinion, what were the most enduring accomplishments that you made? And what accomplishments are you most concerned might be changed or reversed?
Well, look, the 2 greatest accomplishments were the ones I'm the most proud of, were the ones sort of at the beginning and at the end. The beginning was moving our embassy to Jerusalem. At the end were the Abraham Accords. I believe they're connected. I believe they're closely connected, because I believe that when we stood with Israel and observed our commitment to Israel and showed that we could be trusted to keep a promise, notwithstanding the blowback that we undoubtedly would receive, from international fora and from some of our allies in Europe, when we did that, we demonstrated that we were a reliable friend that could keep a promise. And I think that resonated very much with our Arab friends in the region and helped us, to a large extent, gain their trust and establish credibility with them. Oddly enough, it wasn't something they found offensive. They actually found it courageous that we were able to keep that promise, because they knew that, it was a law that we passed in 1995, and it was a promise that the president had made. So those 2 things, those bookends, really are the ones that I'm the most proud of. I don't think either one of them is at risk. I don't think, the president's made it clear he's not moving the embassy back. And I think the Abraham Accords right now are bigger than all of us. I think because they've now left the politicians and have now become embraced by the people, by the business leaders, by the educators, by the tourists, by the people in modern culture. So I think that, I do think we left the Middle East in a better place than we found it. And that's always going to be one of the apart from, my kids and my family, my grandchildren, that's certainly the greatest point of pride that I have in my life.
Ambassador David Friedman, it was a real honor being able to spend this time with you tonight. And we do look forward to your being at Temple Emanu-El in person. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and to remind you that Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, whose confirmation hearing took place yesterday, will join us at Temple Emanu-El for Shabbat services this coming Friday at 6 o'clock. You're welcome to join us in person or online. We look forward to hearing from her. Mr. Ambassador, again, thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was my honor as well. Thank you.